Story 11 of O. Henry Memorial Award Prize Stories of 1919 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 11, The Trial in Tom Belcher's Store by Samuel A. Terrier from the American Magazine. It was a plain case of affinity between Davy Allen and Old Man Thornycroft's hound dog, Buck. Davy, hurrying home along the country road one cold winter afternoon, his mind intent on finishing his chores before dark, looking back after passing Old Man Thornycroft's house to find Buck trying to follow him. Trying to, because the old man, who hated to see anybody or anything but himself have his way, had chained a heavy block to him to keep him from doing what nature had intended him to do, roam the woods and poke his long nose into every briar patch after rabbits. At the sight, Davy stopped, and the dog came on, dragging behind him in the road the block of wood fastened by a chain to his collar, and trying at the same time to wag his tail. He was tan-colored, lean as a rail, long-eared, a hound every inch. And Davy was a ragged country boy who lived alone with his mother, and who had an old single-barrel shotgun at home, and who had in his grave boy's eyes a look, clear and unmistakable, of woods and fields. To say it was love at first sight when that hound, dragging his prison around with him, looked up into the boy's face, and when that ragged boy, who loved the woods and had a gun at home, looked down into the hound's eyes, would hardly be putting it strong enough. It was more than love. It was perfect understanding, perfect comprehension. "I'm your dog," said the hound's upraised, melancholy eyes. "I'll jump rabbits and bring them round for you to shoot. I'll make the frosty hills echo with music for you. I'll follow you everywhere you go. I'm your dog, if you want me, yours to the end of my days." And Davy, looking down into those upraised, beseeching eyes, and at that heavy block of wood, and at the raw place the collar had worn on the neck, then at Old Man Thornycroft's bleak, unpainted house on the hill, with the unhomelike yard and the tumble-down fences, felt a great pity, the pity of the free for the imprisoned, and a great longing to own, not a dog, but this dog. "Want to come along?" he grinned. The hound sat down on his haunches, elevated his long nose, and poured out to the cold winter sky the passion and longing of his soul. Davy understood, shook his head, looked once more into the pleading eyes, then at the bleak house from which this prisoner had dragged himself. "That old devil," he said. "He ain't fittin' to own a dog. Oh, I wish he was mine." A moment he hesitated there in the road, then he turned and hurried away from temptation. "He ain't mine," he muttered. "Oh, damn it all!" But temptation followed him, as it has followed many a boy and man. A little way down the road was a pasture through which by a footpath he could cut off half a mile of the 3 miles that lay between him and home. Poised on top of the high rail fence that bordered the road, he looked back. The hound was still trying to follow, walking straddle-legged, head down, all entangled with the taut chain that dragged the heavy block. The boy watched the frantic efforts, pity and longing on his face. Then he jumped off the fence inside the pasture and hurried on down the hill, face set straight ahead. He had entered a pine thicket when he heard behind the frantic, choking yelps of a dog in dire distress. Knowing what had happened, he ran back. Within the pasture the hound, only his hind feet touching the ground, was struggling and pawing at the fence. He had jumped, the block had caught, and was hanging him. Davy rushed to him. Breathing fast, he unclicked the chain. The block and chain fell on the other side of the fence, and the dog was free. Shrewdly the boy looked back up the road. The woods hid the old man's house from view, and no one was to be seen. With a little grin of triumph he turned and broke into a run down the pasture hill toward the pines, the wind blowing gloriously into his face, the dog galloping beside him. Still running, the two came out into the road that led home, and suddenly Davy stopped short and his face flushed. Yonder, round the bend, on his gray mare jogged Squire Kirby toward them, his pipe in his mouth, his white beard stuck cozily inside the bosom of his big overcoat. There was no use to run, no use to try to make the dog hide, no use to try to hide himself. The old man had seen them both. Suppose he knew whose dog this was? Heart-pounding, Davy waited beside the road. Mr. Kirby drew rein opposite him and looked down with eyes that twinkled under his bushy white brows. He always stopped to ask the boy how his mother was and how they were getting along. Davy had been to his house many a time with eggs and chickens to sell, or with a load of seasoned oak wood. Many a time he had warmed before Mr. Kirby's fire in the big living and bedroom combined, and eaten Mrs. Kirby's fine white cake covered with frosting. Never before had he felt ill at ease in the presence of the kindly old man. "That's a genuine hound you got there, son, ain't it?" "Yes, sir," said Davy. "Good for rabbits and 'possums and coons, eh?" "He sure is." "Well, next big fat 'possum you and him catch, you bring that 'possum round, and me and you will talk business. Maybe we'll strike a bargain. Got any good sweet potatoes? Well, you bring 4 or 5 bushels along to eat that 'possum with. Haulin' any wood these days? Bring me a load or 2 of good dry oak. Pick it out, son, here. How's your ma? All right? Oh, that's good. Here." He reached deep down in a pocket of his enormous faded overcoat, brought out 2 red apples, and leaned down out of his saddle that creaked under the strain of his weight. "Try one of 'em yourself, and take one of 'em home to your ma. Get up, Mag." He jogged on down the road, and the boy, sobered, walked on. One thing was certain, though. Mr. Kirby hadn't known whose dog this was. What difference did it make, anyhow? He hadn't stolen anything. He couldn't let a dog choke to death before his eyes. What did Old Man Thornycroft care about a dog, anyhow, the hard-hearted old skinflint? He remembered the trouble his mother had had when his father died, and Old Man Thornycroft pushed her for a note he had given. He had heard people talk about it at the time, and he remembered how white his mother's face had been. Old Man Thornycroft had refused to wait, and his mother had had to sell 5 acres of the best land on the little farm to pay the note. It was after the sale that Mr. Kirby, who lived 5 miles away, had ridden over. "Why didn't you let me know, Mrs. Allen?" he had demanded. "I would have loaned you the money, gladly, gladly." He had risen from the fire and pulled on the same overcoat he wore now. It was faded then, and that was 2 years ago. It was sunset when Davy reached home to find his mother out in the clean-swept yard picking up chips in her apron. From the bedroom window of the little one-storied, unpainted house came a bright red glow, and from the kitchen the smell of cooking meat. His mother straightened up from her task with a smile when, with his new-found partner, he entered the yard. "Why, Davy," she asked, "where did you get him?" He just followed me, Ma." "But whose dog is he?" "He's mine, Ma. He just took up with me." "Where, Davy?" "Oh, on the way down the road, in a pasture." "He must belong to somebody." "He's just a old hound dog, Ma, that's all he is. Lots of hounds don't belong to nobody. Everybody knows that, Ma. Look at him, Ma. Mighty nigh starved to death. Let me keep him. We can feed him on scraps. He can sleep under the house. Me and him will keep you in rabbits. You won't have to kill no more chickens. Nobody don't want him but me." From her gaunt height she looked down into the boy's eager eyes, then at the dog beside him. "All right, son," she said, "if he don't belong to anybody." That night Davy alternately whistled and talked to the dog beside him as he husked the corn he had raised with his own hands, and chopped the wood he had cut and hauled, for since his father's death he had kept things going. He ate supper in a sort of daze. He hurried out with a tin plate of scraps. He fed the grateful, hungry dog on the kitchen steps. He begged some Vaseline from his mother and rubbed it on the sore neck. Then he got 2 or 3 empty gunny sacks out of the corn crib, crawled under the house to a warm place beside the chimney, and spread them out for a bed. He went into the house whistling. He didn't hear a word of the chapter his mother read out of the Bible. Before he went to bed in the shed room, He raised the window. "You all right, old feller?" he called. Underneath the house he heard the responsive tap-tap of a tail in the dry dust. He climbed out of his clothes, leaving them in a pile in the middle of the floor, tumbled into bed, and pulled the covers high over him. "Golly!" he said. "Oh, golly!" Next day he hunted till sundown. The Christmas holidays were on, and there was no thought of school. He went only now and then, anyway, for since his father's death there was too much for him to do at home. He hunted in the opposite direction from Old Man Thornycroft's. It was 3 miles away. Barriers of woods and bottoms and hills lay between, and the old man seldom stirred beyond the boundaries of his own farm. But Davy wanted to be on the safe side. There were moments, though, when he thought of the old man and wondered if he had missed the dog and whether he would make any search for him. There were sober moments, too, when he thought of his mother and Mr. Kirby and wished he had told them the truth. But then the long-drawn bay of the hound would come from the bottoms ahead, and he would hurry to the summons, his face flushed and eager. The music of the dog running, the sound of the shots, and his own triumphant yells started many an echo among the silent frosted hills that day. He came home with enough meat to last a week, 6 rabbits. As he hurried into the yard he held them up for the inspection of his mother, who was feeding the chickens. "He's the finest rabbit dog ever was, Ma. Oh, golly, he can follow a trail. I never see anything like it, Ma. I never did. I'll skin him and clean him after supper. You ought to have saw him, Ma. Golly!" And while he chopped the wood and milked the cow and fed the mule and skinned the rabbits, he saw other days ahead like this, and whistled and sang and talked to the hound, who followed close at his heels every step he took. Then one afternoon, while he was patching the lot fence, with Buck sunning himself near the woodpile, came Old Man Thornycroft. Davy recognized his buggy as it turned the bend in the road. He quickly dropped his tools, called Buck to him, and got behind the house where he could see without being seen. The buggy stopped in the road, and the old man, his hard, pinched face working, his buggy whip in his hand, came down the walk and called Mrs. Allen out on the porch. "I just come to tell you," he cried, "that your boy Davy run off with my dog last Friday evening. There ain't no use to deny it. I know all about it. I seen him when he passed in front of the house. I found the block I had chained to the dog beside the road. I heerd Squire Jim Kirby talking to some men in Tom Belcher's store this very morning. Just happened to overhear him as I come in. A boy and a dog, he says, is the happiest combination in natur'. Then he went on to tell about your boy and a tan dog. He had met him in the road. Met him when? Last Friday evening. And there ain't no use to deny it, Mrs. Allen. Your boy Davy, he stole my dog." "Mr. Thornycroft!" Dave could not see his mother, but he could hear her voice tremble. He did not know whose dog it was. "He didn't? He didn't?" yelled the old man. "And him a boy that knows every dog for 10 miles round? Right in front of my house, I tell you. That's where he picked him up. That's where he told him off. Didn't I tell you, woman, I seen him pass? Didn't I tell you I found the block down the road? Didn't know whose dog it was? Ridiculous! Ridiculous! Call him. Ask him. Face him with it. Likely he'll lie, but you'll see his face. Call him. That's all I ask. Call him." "Davy!" called Mrs. Allen. "Davy!" Just a moment the boy hesitated. Then he went around the house. The hound stuck very close to him, eyes full of terror, tail tucked as he looked at the old man. "There he is, with my dog!" cried the old man. "You didn't know whose dog it was, did you, son? You didn't know, now did you?" "Yes," cried the boy, "I knowed." "Hear that, Mrs. Allen? Did he know? What do you say now? He stole my dog, didn't he? That's what he done, didn't he? Answer me, woman. You come here," he yelled, his face livid, and started, whip raised, toward boy and dog. There were some smooth white stones the size of hen eggs arranged around a flower bed in the yard, and Davy stood near these stones, and now, quick as a flash, he stooped down and picked one up. "You stop!" he panted, his face very white. His mother cried out and came running toward him, but Thornycroft had stopped. No man in his right mind wants to advance on a country boy with a rock. Goliath tried it once. "All right," screamed the old man. "You steal first, then you try to assault an old man. I didn't come here to raise no row. I just came here to warn you, Mrs. Allen. I'll have the law on that boy. I'll have the law on him before another sun sets." He turned and hurried toward the buggy. Davy dropped the rock. Mrs. Allen stood looking at the old miser, who was clambering into his buggy, with a sort of horror. Then she ran toward the boy. "Oh, Davy, run after him! Take the dog to him! He's terrible, Davy, terrible! Run after him! Anything, anything!" But the boy looked up at her with grim mouth and hard eyes. "I ain't a-goin' to do it, Ma," he said. It was after supper that very night that the summons came. Bob Kelley, rural policeman, brought it. "Me and Squire Kirby went down this mornin'," he said, "to look up some things about court in the mornin'. This evenin' we run into old man Thornycroft on the street lookin' for us. He was awful excited. He had been to Mr. Kirby's house and found out Mr. Kirby was in town, and followed us. He wanted a warrant swore out right there. Mr. Kirby tried to argue with him, but it warn't no use. So at last Mr. Kirby turned to me. 'You go on back, Bob,' he said. 'This'll give me some more lookin' up to do. Tell my wife I'll just spend the night with Judge Fowler and get back in time for court in Belcher's store in the mornin'. And, Bob, you just stop by Mrs. Allen's she's guardian of the boy and tell her I say to bring him to Belcher's store to morrow mornin' at 9. You be there, too, Mr. Thornycroft. And, by the way, bring that block of wood you been talkin' about.'" This was all the squire had said, declared the rural policeman. No, he hadn't sent any other message, just said he would read up on the case. The rural policeman went out and closed the door behind him. It had been informal, haphazard, like the life of the community in which they lived. But for all that, the law had knocked at the door of the Widow Allen and left a white-faced mother and a bewildered boy behind. They tried to resume their usual employments. Mrs. Allen sat down beside the table, picked up her sewing, and put her glasses on. But her hands trembled when she tried to thread the needle. Davy sat on a split-bottomed chair in the corner, his feet up on the rungs, and tried to be still. But his heart was pounding fast, and there was a lump in his throat. Presently he got up and went out of doors to get in some kindling on the back porch before it snowed, he told his mother. But he went because he couldn't sit there any longer, because he was about to explode with rage and grief and fear and bitterness. He did not go toward the wood-pile. What difference did dry kindling make now? At the side of the house he stooped down and softly called Buck. The hound came to him, wriggling along under the beams, and he leaned against the house and lovingly pulled the briar-torn ears. A long time he stayed there, feeling on his face already the fine mist of snow. Tomorrow the ground would be white. It didn't snow often in that country. Day after tomorrow everybody would hunt rabbits, everybody but him and Buck. It was snowing hard when at last he went into the warm room, so warm that he pulled off his coat. Once more he tried to sit still in the split-bottomed chair. But there is no rage that consumes like the rage of a boy. In its presence he is so helpless. If he were a man, thought Davy, he would go to old man Thornycroft's house that night, call him out, and thrash him in the road. If he were a man, he would curse, he would do something. He looked wildly about the room, the hopelessness of it all coming over him in a wave. Then suddenly, because he wasn't a man, because he couldn't do what he wanted to do, he began to cry, not as a boy cries, but more as a man cries, in shame and bitterness, his shoulders shaken by great convulsive sobs, his head buried in his hands, his fingers running through his tangled mop of hair. "Davy, Davy!" The sewing and the scissors slipped to the floor. His mother was down on her knees beside him, one arm about his shoulders, trying to pry his face from his hands, trying to look into his eyes. "You're my man, Davy. You're the only man, the only help I've got. You're my life, Davy. Poor boy, poor child." He caught hold of her convulsively, and she pressed his head against her breast. Then he saw that she was crying, and he grew quiet and wiped his eyes with his ragged coat sleeve. "I'm all right now, Ma," he said. But he looked at her wildly. She did not follow him into his little unceiled bedroom. She must have known that he had reached that age where no woman could help him. It must be a man now to whom he could pin his faith, and while he lay awake, tumbling and tossing, along with bitter thoughts of Old Man Thornycroft came other bitter thoughts of Mr. Kirby, whom deep down in his boy's heart he had worshipped, Mr. Kirby who had sided with Old Man Thornycroft and sent a summons with no message for him. "God!" he said. "God!" and pulled his hair down there under the covers. And he hated the law that would take a dog from him and give it back to that old man, the law that Mr. Kirby represented. It was still snowing when next morning he and his mother drove out of the yard, and he turned the head of the reluctant old mule in the direction of Belcher's store. A bitter wind cut their faces, but it was not as bitter as the heart of the boy. Only twice on that 5-mile ride did he speak. The first time was when he looked back to find Buck, whom he had left at home, thinking he would stay under the house on such a day, following very close behind the buggy. "Might as well let him come on," said the boy. The second time was when they came in sight of Belcher's store, dim yonder under the swirling snow. Then he looked up into his mother's face. "Ma," he said grimly, "I ain't no thief." She smiled as bravely as she could with her stiffened face and with the tears so near the surface. She told him that she knew it and that everybody knew it. But there was no answering smile on the boy's set face. The squire's gray mare, standing huddled up in the midst of the other horses and buggies under the shed near the store, told that court had probably already convened. Hands numb, the boy hitched the old mule to the only rack left under the shed, then made Buck lie down under the buggy. Heart pounding, he went up on the store porch with his mother and pushed the door open. There was a commotion when they entered. The men, standing about the pot-bellied stove, their overcoats steaming, made way for them. Old Man Thornycroft looked quickly and triumphantly around. In the rear of the store, the squire rose from a table in front of which was a cleared space. "Pull up a chair nigh the stove for Mrs. Allen, Tom Belcher," he said. "I'm busy trying this chicken-stealing nigger. When I get through, Mrs. Allen, if you're ready, I'll call your case." Davy stood beside his mother while the trial of the negro proceeded. Some of the fight had left him now, crowded down here among all these grown men, and especially in the presence of Mr. Kirby, for it is hard for a boy to be bitter long. But with growing anxiety he heard the sharp questions the magistrate asked the negro. He saw the frown of justice, he heard the sentence, 60 days on the gang. And the negro had stolen only a chicken. And he had run off with another man's dog. "The old man's rough this mornin'," a man whispered to another above him, and he saw the furtive grin on the face of Old Man Thornycroft, who leaned against the counter, waiting. His heart jumped into his mouth when, after a silence, the magistrate spoke. "Mr. Thornycroft, step forward, sir. Put your hand on the book here. Now tell us about that dog of yours that was stole." Looking first at the magistrate, then at the crowd, as if to impress them also, the old man told in a high-pitched, excited voice all the details: his seeing Davy Allen pass in front of his house last Friday afternoon, his missing the dog, his finding the block of wood down the road beside the pasture fence, his overhearing the squire's talk right here in the store, his calling on Mrs. Allen, the boys threatening him. "I tell you," he cried, "that's a dangerous character, that boy." "Is that all you've got to say?" asked the squire. "It's enough, ain't it?" demanded Thornycroft angrily. The squire nodded and spat into the cuspidor between his feet. "I think so," he said quietly. "Stand aside. Davy Allen, step forward. Put your hand on the book here, son. Davy, how old are you?" The boy gulped. 13 years old, going on 14. "You're old enough, son, to know the nater of the oath you're about to take. For over 2 years you've been the mainstay and support of your mother. You've had to carry the burdens and responsibilities of a man, Davy. The testimony you give in this case will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. What about it?" Davy nodded, his face very white. "All right now. Tell us about it. Talk loud so we can hear, all of us." The boy's eyes never left Mr. Kirby's while he talked. Something in them held him, fascinated him, overawed him. Very large and imposing he looked there behind his little table, with his faded old overcoat on, and there was no sound in the room but the boy's clear voice. "And you come off and left the dog at first?" "Yes, sir." "And you didn't unfasten the chain from the block till the dog got caught in the fence?" "No, sir, I didn't." "Did you try to get him to follow you then?" "No, sir, he wanted to." "Ask him, Mr. Kirby," spoke in Thornycroft angrily, "if he tried to drive him home." "I'll ask him whatever seems fit and right to me, sir," said Mr. Kirby. "What did you tell your ma, Davy, when you got home?" "I told her he followed me." "Did you tell her whose dog he was?" "No, sir." "Ain't that what you ought to have done? Ain't it?" Davy hesitated. "Yes, sir." There was a slight shuffling movement among the men crowded about. Somebody cleared his throat. Mr. Kirby resumed. "This block you've been telling about, how was it fastened to the dog?" "There was a chain fastened to the block by a staple. The other end was fastened to the collar." "How heavy do you think that block was?" "'Bout 10 pound, I reckon." "5," broke in Old Man Thornycroft with a sneer. Mr. Kirby turned to him. "You fetched it with you, didn't you?" "I told you to. It's evidence. Bob Kelley, go out to Mr. Thornycroft's buggy and bring that block of wood into court." The room was silent while the rural policeman was gone. Davy stood still in the cleared space before Mr. Kirby, his ragged overcoat on, his tattered hat in his hand, breathing fast, afraid to look at his mother. Everybody turned when Kelley came in with the block of wood. Everybody craned their necks to watch, while at the magistrate's order Kelley weighed the block of wood on the store scales, which he put on the magistrate's table. "14 pounds," said Mr. Kirby. "Take the scales away." "It had rubbed all the skin off'n the dog's neck," broke in Davy impulsively. "It was all raw and bleedin'." "Aw, that ain't so!" cried Thornycroft. "Is the dog out there?" asked Mr. Kirby. "Yes, sir, under the buggy." "Bob Kelley, you go out and bring that dog into court." The rural policeman went out and came back with the hound, who looked eagerly up from one face to the other, then seeing Davy, came to him and stood against him, still looking around with that expression of melancholy on his face that a hound dog always wears, except when he's in action. "Bring the dog here, son," commanded Mr. Kirby. He examined the raw place on the neck. "Any of you gentlemen care to take a look?" he asked. "It was worse than that," declared Davy, "till I rubbed Vaseline on it." Old Man Thornycroft pushed forward, face quivering. "What's all this got to do with the boy stealing the dog?" he demanded. "That's what I want to know. What's it got to do?" "Mr. Thornycroft," said Kirby, "at 9 o'clock this morning this place ceased to be Tom Belcher's store and became a court of justice. Some things are seemly in a court, some not. You stand back there." The old man stepped back to the counter and stood pulling his chin, his eyes running over the crowd of faces. "Davy Allen," spoke Mr. Kirby, "stand back there with your ma. Tom Belcher, make a way for him. And Tom, s'pose you put another stick of wood in the stove and poke up the fire." He took off his glasses, blew on them, polished them with his handkerchief, and readjusted them. Then, leaning back in his chair, he spoke. "Gentlemen, from the beginnin' of time, as fur back as records go, a dog's been the friend, companion, and protector of man. Folks say he come from the wolf, but that ain't no reflection on him, seein' that we come from monkeys ourselves, and I believe, takin' all things into account, I'd as soon have a wolf for a ancestor as a monkey and a little brother. Last night, in the libery of my old friend Judge Fowler in town, I looked up some things about this dog question. I find that there have been some queer decisions handed down by the courts, showin' that the law does recognize the fact that a dog is different from other four-footed critters. For instance, it has been held that a dog has a right to protect not only his life but his dignity. that where a man worries a dog beyond what would be reasonable to expect any self-respecting critter to stand, that dog has a right to bite that man, and that man can't collect any damages, provided the biting is done at the time of the worrying and in sudden heat of passion. That has been held in the courts, gentlemen. The law that holds for man holds for dogs. Another thing, if the engineer of a railroad train sees a cow or a horse or a sheep on the track, or a hog, he must stop the train, or the road is liable for any damage done him. But if he sees a man walking along the track, he has a right to presume that the man, being a critter of more or less intelligence, will get off, and he is not called on to stop under ordinary circumstances. The same thing holds true of a dog. The engineer has a right to presume that the dog, being a critter of intelligence, will get off the track. Here again the law is the same for dog and man. But if the engineer has reason to believe that the man's mind is took up with some object of an engrossing nature, he is supposed to stop the train till the man comes to himself and looks around. The same thing holds true of a dog. If the engineer has reason to suspect that the dog's mind is occupied with some engrossing topic, he must stop the train. That case has been tested in this very state, where a dog was on the track setting a covey of birds in the adjoining field. The railroad was held responsible for the death of that dog, because the engineer ought to have known by the action of the dog that his mind was on something else besides railroad trains and locomotives. Again the magistrate spat into the cuspidor between his feet. Davy, still watching him, felt his mother's grip on his arm. Everyone was listening so closely that the whispered, sneering comment of Old Man Thornycroft to the man next to him was audible. "What's all this got to do with the case?" "The p'int I'm getting to is this," went on Mr. Kirby, not paying attention to him. "A dog is not like a cow or a horse or any four-footed critter. He's an individual, and so the courts have held in spirit, if not in actual words. Now this court of mine here in Tom Belcher's store ain't like other courts. I have to do the deciding myself. I have to interpret the true spirit of the law without technicalities and quibbles such as beclouded in other and higher courts. And I hold that since a dog is de facto and de jure an individual, he has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Therefore, gentlemen, I hold that that hound dog, Buck, had a perfect right to follow that boy Davy Allen there. And I hold that Davy Allen was not called on to drive that dog back, or interfere in any way with that dog following him, if the dog so chose. You've heard the evidence of the boy. You know, and I know, he has spoke the truth this day, and there ain't no evidence to the contrary. The boy did not entice the dog. He even went down the road, leaving him behind. He run back only when the dog was in dire need and choking to death. He wasn't called on to put that block and chain back on the dog. He couldn't help it if the dog followed him. He no more stole that dog than I stole him. He's no more a thief than I am. I dismiss this case, Mr. Thornycroft, this case you've brought against Davy Allen, and I declare him innocent of the charge of theft. I set it down right here on the records of this court." "Davy!" gasped Mrs. Allen. "Davy!" But, face working, eyes blazing, Old Man Thornycroft started forward, and the dog, panting, shrank between boy and mother. "Jim Kirby," cried the old man, stopping for a moment in the cleared space, "you're magistrate. What you say goes. But that dog thar, he's mine. He's my property, mine by law." He jerked a piece of rope out of his overcoat pocket and came on toward the cowering dog. "Tom Belcher, Bob Kelley, stop that dog. He's mine." "Davy!" Mrs. Allen was holding the boy. Don't say anything. You're free to go home. Your record's clear. The dog's his." "Hold on." Mr. Kirby had risen from his chair. "You come back here, Mr. Thornycroft. This court's not adjourned yet. If you don't get back, I'll stick a fine to you for contempt. You'll remember the rest of your days. You stand where you are, sir. Right there. Don't move till I'm through." Quivering, the old man stood where he was. Mr. Kirby sat down, face flushed, eyes blazing. "Punch up that fire, Tom Belcher," he said. "I ain't through yet." The hound came trembling back to Davy, looked up in his face, licked his hand, then sat down at the side opposite his former master, looking around now and then at the old man, terror in his eyes. In the midst of a deathly silence the magistrate resumed. "What I was going to say, gentlemen, is this. I'm not only magistrate, I'm an officer of an organization that you country fellers likely don't know of, an organization known as the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. As such an officer, it's my duty to report and bring to trial any man who treats a dumb brute in a cruel and inhuman way. Mr. Thornycroft, judging by the looks of that hound, you ain't given him enough to eat to keep a cat alive. And a cat, we all know, don't eat much, just messes over her victuals. You condemn that poor beast for no fault of his own to the life of a felon. A hound that ain't happy at best, he's melancholy, and a hound that ain't allowed to run free is of all creatures the wretchedest. This hound's neck is rubbed raw. God only knows what he's suffered in mind and body. A man that would treat a dog that way ain't fittin' to own one. And I hereby notify you that, on the evidence of this boy and the evidence before our eyes, I will indict you for breaking the law regarding the treatment of animals. And I notify you, furthermore, that as magistrate I'll put the law on you for that same thing. And it might be interesting to you to know, sir, that I can fine you as much as $500 or send you to jail for 1 year, or both, if I see fit. And there ain't no telling but what I will see fit, sir." He looked sternly at Thornycroft. "Now I'm going to make a proposition that I advise you to jump at like you never jumped at anything before. If you'll give up that hound, Buck, to me, say, or to anybody I decide will be kind to him, I will let the matter drop. If you will go home like a peaceable citizen, you won't hear no more about it from me. But if you don't—" "Get out of my way!" cried Old Man Thornycroft. "All of you, I'm going! "Hold on," said Mr. Kirby, when he had got almost to the door. "Do you, in the presence of these witnesses, turn over this dog to me, relinquishing all claims to him on the conditions named? Answer, yes or no?" There was a moment's silence. Then the old man cried out, "Take the old hound. He ain't worth the salt of his victuals." He jerked the door open. "Yes or no?" cried Mr. Kirby inexorably. "Yes!" yelled the old man, and slammed the door behind him. "1 minute, gentlemen," said Mr. Kirby, rising from the table and gathering his papers and records together. "Just one more thing. If anybody here has any evidence, or knows of any, tending to show that this boy Davy Allen is not the proper person to turn over a hound dog to, I hope he will speak up." He waited a moment. "In the absence of any objections, and considering the evidence that's been given here this morning, I think I'll just let that dog go back the way he come. Thank you, gentlemen. Court's adjourned." End of Story 11. Story 12 of O. Henry Memorial Award Prize Stories of 1919 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 12, Porcelain Cups by James Branch Cobell from Century Magazine. 1. Of Greatness Intimately Viewed. "Oh, but they are beyond praise," said Cynthia Allonby, enraptured, "and certainly you should have presented them to the Queen." "Her Majesty already possesses a cup of that ware," replied Lord Pevensey. "It was one of her New Year's gifts from Robert Cecil. Hers is, I believe, not quite so fine as either of yours, but then, they tell me, there is not the like of this pair in England, nor indeed on the hither side of Cataia." He set the 2 pieces of Chinese pottery upon the shelves in the south corner of the room. These cups were of that sea-green tint called celadon, with a very wonderful glow and radiance. Such oddities were the last vogue in court in this year of grace 1593, and Cynthia could not but speculate as to what monstrous sum Lord Pevensey had paid for this his last gift to her. Now he turned smiling, a really superb creature in his blue and gold. "I had another message from the Queen." "George," Cynthia said with fond concern, It frightens me to see you thus foolhardy in tempting alike the Queen's anger and the plague." "As goes the plague, it spares 9 out of 10," he answered lightly. "The Queen, I grant you, is another pair of sleeves, for an irritated tutor spares nobody." But Cynthia Allonby kept silence, and did not exactly smile while she appraised her famous young kinsman. She was flattered by, and a little afraid of, the gay self-confidence which led anybody to take such chances. 2 weeks ago it was that the painted terrible old Queen had named Lord Pevensey to go straightway into France, where, rumour had it, King Henry was preparing to renounce the reformed religion and making his peace with the Pope. And for 2 weeks Pevensey had lingered, on one pretence or another, at his house in London, with the plague creeping about the city like an invisible, incalculable flame, and the Queen asking questions at Windsor. Of all the monarchs that had ever reigned in England, Elizabeth was the least used to having her orders disregarded. Meanwhile, Lord Pevensey came every day to the Marquis of Falmouth's lodgings at Deptford, and every day Lord Pevensey pointed out to the Marquis's daughter that Pevensey, whose wife had died in childbirth a year back, did not intend to go into France, for nobody could foretell how long a stay as a widower. Certainly it was all very flattering. "Yes, and you would be an excellent match," said Cynthia aloud, "if that were all. And yet what must I reasonably expect in marrying, sir, the famous Earl of Pevensey? A great deal of love and petting, my dear. And if there were anything else to which you had a fancy, I would get it for you." Her glance went to those lovely cups and lingered fondly. "Yes, dear Master Generosity, if it could be purchased or manufactured, you would get it for me." "If it exists, I will get it for you," he declared. "I think that it exists, but I am not learned enough to know what it is. George, if I married you, I would have money and fine clothes and soft hours and many lackeys to wait on me, and honor from all men. And you would be kind to me, I know, when you return from the day's work at Windsor, or Holyrood, or the Louvre. But do you not see that I would always be to you only a rather costly luxury, like those cups, which the Queen's minister could afford to keep for his hours of leisure?" He answered, "You are all in all to me. You know it. Oh, very well do you know and abuse your power, you adorable and lovely baggage, who have kept me dancing attendance for a fortnight without ever giving me an honest yes or no." He gesticulated. "Well, but life is very dull in Deptford village, and it amuses you to twist a Queen's adviser round your finger. I see it plainly, you minx, and I acquiesce because it delights me to give you pleasure, even at the cost of some dignity. Yet I may no longer shirk the Queen's business. No, not even to amuse you, my dear." "You said you had heard from her. Again?" "I had this morning my orders under Gloriana's own fair hand, either to depart to morrow into France, or else to come to morrow to Windsor. I need not say that in the circumstances I consider France the more wholesome." Now the girl's voice was hurt and wistful. "So, for the 1000th time, is it proven the Queen's business means more to you than I do? Yes, certainly it is just as I said, George." He observed, unruffled, "My dear, I scent unreason. This is a high matter. If the French King compounds with Rome, it means war for Protestant England. Even you must see that." She replied sadly, "Yes, even I. Oh, certainly, my lord. Even a half-witted child of 17 can perceive as much as that." "I was not speaking of half-witted persons, as I remember. Well, it chances that I am honored by the friendship of our gallant Bernay, and I am supposed to have some claim upon him, thanks to my good fortune last year in saving his life from the assassin Belcher. It chances that I may perhaps become, under Providence, the instrument of preserving my fellow countrymen from much grief and trumpet sounding and throat cutting. Instead of pursuing that chance, 2 weeks ago, as was my duty, I have dangled at your apron strings in the vain hope of softening the most variable and hardest heart in the world. Now, clearly, I have not the right to do that any longer." She admired the ennobled, the slightly rapt look which she knew denoted that George Bulmer was doing his duty as he saw it, even in her disappointment. "No, you have not the right. You are wedded to your statecraft, to your patriotism, to your self-advancement, or christen it what you will. You are wedded, at all events, to your man's business. You have not time for such trifles as giving a maid that foolish and lovely sort of wooing to which every maid looks forward in her heart of hearts. Indeed, when you married the first time, it was a kind of infidelity, and I am certain that poor dear mouse-like Mary must have felt that often and over again. Why, do you not see, George, even now, that your wife will always come second to your real love?" "In my heart, dear sophist, you will always come first. But it is not permitted that any loyal gentleman devote every hour of his life to sighing and making sonnets, and to the general solacing of a maid's loneliness in this dull little Deptford. Nor would you, I am sure, desire me to do so." "I hardly know what I desire," she told him ruefully. "But I know that when you talk of your man's business, I am lonely and chilled and far away from you. And I know that I cannot understand more than half your fine high notions about duty and patriotism and serving England and so on," the girl declared. And she flung wide her lovely little hands in a despairing gesture. "I admire you, sir, when you talk of England. It makes you handsomer, yes, even handsomer, somehow. But all the while I am remembering that England is just an ordinary island, inhabited by a number of ordinary persons, for the most of whom I have no particular feeling, one way or the other." Pevensey looked at her for a while with queer tenderness. Then he smiled. "No, I could not quite make you understand, my dear. But why fuddle that quaint little brain by trying to understand such matters as lie without your realm? For a woman's kingdom is the home, my dear, and her throne is in the heart of her husband. All this is but another way of saying, your lordship would have us cups upon a shelf," she pointed out, "in readiness for your leisure." He shrugged, said "Nonsense," and began more lightly to talk of other matters. Thus and thus he would do in France, and such trinkets he would fetch back, as toys for the most whimsical, the loveliest and the most obstinate child in all the world, he phrased it. And they would be married, Pevensey declared, in September. Nor, he gaily said, did he propose to have any further argument about it. Children should be seen. The proverb was dusty, but it particularly applied to pretty children. Cynthia let him talk. She was just a little afraid of his self-confidence, and of this tall nobleman's habit of getting what he wanted in the end. But she dispiritedly felt that Pevensey had failed her. He treated her as a silly infant, and his want of her, even in that capacity, was a secondary matter. He was going into France, for all his petting talk, and was leaving her to shift as she best might, until he could spare the time to resume his love-making. 2. What comes of scribbling? Now, when Pevensey had gone, the room seemed darkened by the withdrawal of so much magnificence. Cynthia watched from the window as the tall earl rode away with 3 handsomely clad retainers. Yes, George was very fine and admirable, no doubt of it. Even so, there was relief in the reflection that for a month or 2 she was rid of him. Turning, she faced a lean, dishevelled man who stood by the Magdalen tapestry scratching his chin. He had unquiet, bright eyes, this out-at-elbows poet whom a marquis's daughter was pleased to patronize, and his red hair to-day was unpardonably puzzled. Nor were his manners beyond reproach, for now, without saying anything, he, too, went to the window. He dragged one foot a little as he walked. "So my Lord Pevensey departs. Look how he rides in triumph, like lame Tamerlane, with Techels and Umskane and Terebus to attend him, and with the sunset turning the dust raised by their horses' hoofs into a sort of golden haze around them. It is a beautiful world, and truly, Mistress Cyn, the poet said reflectively, that Pevensey is a very splendid ephemera. If not a king himself, at least he goes magnificently to settle the affairs of kings. Were modesty not my failing, Mistress Cyn, I would acclaim you as strangely lucky in being beloved by two fine fellows that have not their like in England. Truly, you are not always thus modest, Kit Marlowe. But, Lord, how seriously Pevensey takes it all, and himself in particular. Why, there departs from us, in befitting state, a personage whose opinion as to every topic in the world is written legibly in the carriage of those fine shoulders, even when seen from behind and from so considerable a distance. And in not one syllable do any of these opinions differ from the opinions of his great-great-grandfathers. Oho, and hark to Deptford! Now all the oafs in the Corn Market are cheering this bulwark of Protestant England, this rising young hero of a people with no nonsense about them. Yes, it is a very quaint and rather splendid ephemera. A marquis's daughter could not quite approve of the way in which this shoemaker's son, however talented, railed at his betters. Pevensey will be the greatest man in the kingdom some day. Indeed, Kit Marlowe, there are those who say he is that much already. Oh, very probably. Still, I am puzzled by human greatness. A century hence, what will he matter, this Pevensey? His ascent and his declension will have been completed, and his foolish battles and treaties will have given place to other foolish battles and treaties, and oblivion will have swallowed this glistening bluebottle, plumes and fine lace and stately ruff and all. Why, he is but an adviser to the queen of half an island, whereas my Tamerlane was lord of all the golden ancient East. And what does my Tamerlane matter now, save that he gave Kit Marlowe the subject of a drama? Ah, softly enough, for does even that very greatly matter? Who really cares to-day about what scratches were made upon wax by that old Euripides, the latchet of whose sandals I am not worthy to unloose? No, not quite worthy as yet. And thereupon the shabby fellow sat down in the tall, leather-covered chair which Pevensey had just vacated, and this Marlowe nodded his flaming head portentously. Look you, I am displeased, Mistress Cyn. I cannot lend my approval to this over-greedy oblivion that gapes for all. No, it is not a satisfying arrangement that I should teeter insecurely through the void on a gob of mud, and be expected by and by to relinquish even that crazy foothold. Even for Kit Marlowe, death lies in wait, and it may be, not anything more after death, not even any lovely words to play with. Yes, and this Marlowe may amount to nothing after all. And this one chance of amounting to that which he intends may be taken away from him at any moment. He touched the breast of a weather-beaten doublet. He gave her that queer, twisted sort of smile which the girl could not but find attractive, somehow. He said, "Why, but this heart thumping here inside me may stop any moment, like a broken clock. Here is Euripides writing better than I. And here in my body, under my hand, is the mechanism upon which depend all those masterpieces that are to blot the Athenian from the reckoning, and I have no control of it." "Indeed, I fear that you control few things," she told him, "and that least of all do you control your taste for taverns and bad women. Oh, I hear tales of you," and Cynthia raised a reproving forefinger. "True tales, no doubt," he shrugged. Lacking the moon he vainly cried for, the child learns to content himself with a penny whistle. "Ah, but the moon is far away," the girl said, smiling, "too far to hear the sound of human crying. And besides, the moon, as I remember it, was never a very amorous goddess." "Just so," he answered. "Also she was called Cynthia, and she, too, was beautiful." "Yet is it the heart that cries to me, my poet?" she asked him softly, "or just the lips?" "Oh, both of them, most beautiful and inaccessible of goddesses." Then Marlowe leaned toward her, laughing and shaking that disreputable red head. Still, you are very foolish in your latest incarnation to be wasting your rays upon carpet earls who will not outwear a century. Were modesty not my failing, I repeat, I could name somebody who will last longer. Yes, and if but I lacked that plaguy virtue, I would advise you to go a-gypsying with that nameless somebody, so that two mannikins might snatch their little share of the big things that are eternal, just as the butterfly fares intrepidly and joyously with the sun for his torch-boy through a universe wherein thought cannot estimate the unimportance of a butterfly, and wherein not even the chaste moon is very important. Yes, certainly, I would advise you to have done with this vanity of courts and masks, of satins and fans and fiddles, this dallying with tinsels and bright vapors. And very movingly I would exhort you to seek out Arcadia, traveling hand in hand with that still nameless somebody. And of a sudden the restless man began to sing. Sang Kit Marlowe. Come live with me and be my love, and we will all the pleasures prove that hills and valleys, dales and fields, woods or sleepy mountains yield. And we will sit upon the rocks, and see the shepherds feed their flocks by shallow rivers, to whose falls melodious birds sing madrigals. But the girl shook her small, wise head decisively. That is all very fine, but as it happens, there is no such place as this Arcadia, where people can frolic in perpetual sunlight the year round, and find their food and clothing miraculously provided. No, nor can you, I am afraid, give me what all maids really in their heart of hearts desire, far more than any sugar candy Arcadia. Oh, as I have so often told you, Kit, I think you love no woman. You love words, and your seraglio is tenanted by very beautiful words, I grant you, though there is no longer any cestus builded of agate and crystal either, Kit Marlowe. For as you may perceive, sir, I have read all that lovely poem you left with me last Thursday." She saw how interested he was, saw how he almost smirked. "Aha! So you think it not quite bad, eh? The conclusion of my Hero and Leander. It is your best. And your middlemost, my poet, is better than aught else in English," she said politely, knowing how much he delighted to hear such remarks. "Come, I retract my charge of foolishness, for you are plainly a wench of rare discrimination. And yet you say I do not love you. Cynthia, you are beautiful. You are perfect in all things. You are that heavenly Helen of whom I wrote, some persons say acceptably enough. How strange it was I did not know that Helen was dark-haired and pale, for certainly yours is that immortal loveliness which must be served by poets in life and death. And I wonder how much of these ardors," she thought, "is kindled by my praise of his verses." She bit her lip, and she regarded him with a hint of sadness. She said aloud, "But I did not, after all, speak to Lord Pevensey concerning the printing of your poem. Instead, I burned your Hero and Leander." She saw him jump, as under a whip-lash. Then he smiled again in that wry fashion of his. "I lament the loss to letters, for it was my only copy. But you knew that." "Yes, Kit, I knew it was your only copy." "Oho! And for what reason did you burn it, may one ask?" "I thought you loved it more than you loved me. It was my rival, I thought." The girl was conscious of remorse, and yet it was remorse commingled with a mounting joy. "And so you thought a jingle scribbled upon a bit of paper could be your rival with me?" Then Cynthia no longer doubted, but gave a joyous little sobbing laugh, for the love of her disreputable dear poet was sustaining the stringent testing she had devised. She touched his freckled hand caressingly, and her face was as no man had ever seen it, and her voice, too, caressed him. "Ah, you have made me the happiest of women, Kit. Kit, I am almost disappointed in you, though, that you do not grieve more for the loss of that beautiful poem." His smiling did not waver, yet the lean, red-haired man stayed motionless. "Do I appear perturbed?" he said. Why, but see how lightly I take the destruction of my life work in this my masterpiece, for I can assure you it was a masterpiece, the fruit of 2 years' toil and of much loving repolishment." "Ah, but you love me better than such matters, do you not?" she asked him tenderly. "Kit Marlowe, I adore you. Sweetheart, do you not understand that a woman wants to be loved utterly and entirely? She wants no rivals, not even paper rivals. And so often when you talked of poetry I have felt lonely and chilled and far away from you, and I have been half envious, dear, of your heroes and your Helens and your other good-for-nothing Greek minxes. But now I do not mind them at all. And I will make amends, quite prodigal amends, for my naughty jealousy, and my poet shall write me some more lovely poems, so he shall." He said, "You fool!" and she drew away from him, for this man was no longer smiling. "You burned my hero and Leander? You big-eyed fool, you lisping idiot, you wriggling, cuddling worm, you silken bag of guts! Had not even you the wit to perceive it was immortal beauty which would have lived long after you and I were stinking dirt? And you, a half-witted animal, a shining, chattering parrot, lay claws to it?" Marlowe had risen in a sort of seizure, in a condition which was really quite unreasonable when you considered that only a poem was at stake, even a rather long poem. And Cynthia began to smile with tremulous, hurt-looking young lips. "So my poet's love is very much the same as Pevensey's love. And I was right, after all." "Oh," said Marlowe, "that ever a poet should love a woman! What jokes does the lewd flesh contrive!" Of a sudden he was calmer, and then rage fell from him like a dropped cloak, and he viewed her as with respectful wonder. "Why, but you are sitting there with goggling, innocent, bright eyes, are an allegory of all that is most droll and tragic. Yes, and indeed there is no reason to blame you. It is not your fault that every now and then is born a man who serves an idea which is to him the most important thing in the world. It is not your fault that this man perforce inhabits a body to which the most important thing in the world is a woman. Certainly it is not your fault that this compost makes yet another jumble of his two desires, and persuades him that the two are somehow allied. The woman inspires, the woman uplifts, the woman strengthens him for his high work, saith he. Well, well, perhaps there are such women, but by land and sea I have encountered none of them." All this was said while Marlowe shuffled about the room with bent shoulders, and nodding his tousled red head and limping as he walked. Now Marlowe turned, futile and shabby looking, just where Pevensey had loomed resplendent a while since. Again she saw the poet's queer, twisted, jeering smile. "What do you care for my ideas? What do you care for the ideals of that tall earl whom you have held from his proper business for a fortnight? Or for the ideals of any man alive? Why, not one thread of that dark hair, not one snap of those white little fingers, except when ideals irritate you by distracting a man's attention from Cynthia Allonby. Otherwise he is welcome enough to play with his incomprehensible toys." He jerked a thumb toward the shelves behind him. "Ho, ho, you virtuous pretty ladies! What all you value is such matters as those cups. They please the eye, they are worth sound money, and people envy you the possession of them. So you cherish your shiny mud cups, and you burn my hero and Leander. And I declaim all this dull nonsense over the ashes of my ruined dreams, thinking at bottom of how pretty you are, and of how much I would like to kiss you. That is the real tragedy, the immortal tragedy, that I should still hanker after you, my Cynthia." His voice dwelt tenderly upon her name. His fever-haunted eyes were tender, too, for just a moment. Then he grimaced. "No, I am wrong. The tragedy strikes deeper. The root of it is that there is in you and in all your glittering kind no malice, no will to do harm, nor to hurt anything, but just a bland and invincible, and upon the whole a well-meaning stupidity, in forming a bright and soft and delicately scented animal. So you work ruin among those men who serve ideals, not foreplanning ruin, not desiring to ruin anything, not even having sufficient wit to perceive the ruin when it is accomplished. You are, when all is done, not even detestable, not even a worthy peg whereon to hang denunciatory sonnets, you shallow-pated, pretty creatures whom poets and in youth all men are poets whom poets, now and always, are doomed to hanker after to the detriment of their poesy. No, I concede it, you kill without premeditation, and without ever suspecting your hands to be anything but stainless. So in logic I must retract all my harsh words, and I must, without any hint or reproach, endeavor to bid you a somewhat more civil farewell." She had regarded him throughout this preposterous and uncalled for harangue with sad composure, with a forgiving pity. Now she asked him, very quietly, "Where are you going, Kit?" "To the Golden Hind, O gentle, patient, and unjustly persecuted virgin martyr," he answered, with an exaggerated bow, "since that is the part in which you now elect to posture." "Not to that low, vile place again?" "But certainly I intend in that tavern to get tipsy as quickly as possible, for then the first woman I see will for the time become the woman whom I desire, and who exists nowhere." And with that the red-haired man departed, limping and singing as he went, to look for a trull in a pot-house. Sang Kit Marlowe: "And I will make her beds of roses and 1,000 fragrant posies, a cap of flowers and a kirtle embroidered all with leaves of myrtle, a gown made of the finest wool which from our pretty lambs we pull, fair lined slippers for the cold with buckles of the purest gold." 3. Economics of Egeria. She sat quite still when Marlowe had gone. "He will get drunk again," she thought despondently. "Well, and why should it matter to me if he does, after all that outrageous ranting? He has been unforgivably insulting. Oh, but none the less I do not want to have him babbling of the roses and gold of that impossible fairy world which the poor frantic child really believes in, to some painted woman of the town who will laugh at him. I loathe the thought of her laughing at him and kissing him. His notions are wild foolishness, but I at least wish that they were not foolishness, and that hateful woman will not care one way or the other." So Cynthia sighed, and to comfort her forlorn condition fetched a hand mirror from the shelves whereon glowed her green cups. She touched each cup caressingly in passing, and that which she found in the mirror, too, she regarded, not unappreciatively, from varying angles. Yes, after all, dark hair and a pale skin had their advantages at a court where pink and yellow women were so much the fashion as to be common. Men remembered you more distinctively, though nobody cared for men in view of their unreasonable behavior and their absolute self-centeredness. Oh, it was pitiable, it was grotesque, she reflected sadly, how Pevensey and Kit Marlowe had both failed her after so many pretty speeches. Still, there was a queer pleasure in being wooed by Kit. His insane notions went to one's head like wine. She would send Meg for him again to morrow, and Pevensey was, of course, the best match imaginable. No, it would be too heartless to dismiss George Bulmer outright. It was unreasonable of him to desert her because a Gascon threatened to go to mass. But after all, she would probably marry George in the end. He was really most unendurably silly, though, about England and freedom and religion and right and wrong things like that. Yes, it would be tedious to have a husband who often talked to you as though he were addressing a public meeting. However, he was very handsome, particularly in his high-flown and most tedious moments. That year-old son of his was sickly and would probably die soon, the sweet, forlorn little pet, and not be a bother to anybody. And her dear old father would be profoundly delighted by the marriage of his daughter to a man whose wife could have at will a dozen Celadon cups and anything else she chose to ask for. But now the sun had set, and the room was growing quite dark. So Cynthia stood a tiptoe and replaced the mirror upon the shelves, setting it upright behind those wonderful green cups, which had anew reminded her of Pevensey's wealth and generosity. She smiled a little to think of what fun it had been to hold George back, for 2 whole weeks, from discharging that horrible old Queen's stupid errands. 4. Treats philosophically of breakage. The door opened. Stalwart young Captain Edward Musgrave came with a lighted candle, which he placed carefully upon the table in the room's center. He said, "They told me you were here. I come from London. I bring news for you." "You bring no pleasant tidings, I fear." "As Lord Pevensey rode through the Strand this afternoon, on his way home, the plague smote him. That is my sad news. I grieve to bring such news, for your cousin was a worthy gentleman and universally respected." "Ah," Cynthia said, very quietly, "so Pevensey is dead. But the plague kills quickly." "Yes, yes, that is a comfort, certainly. Yes, he turned quite black in the face, they report, and before his men could reach him had fallen from his horse. It was all over almost instantly. I saw him afterward, hardly a pleasant sight. I came to you as soon as I could. I was vexatiously detained." "So George Bulmer is dead in a London gutter. It seems strange, because he was here, befriended by monarchs, and very strong and handsome and self-confident, hardly 2 hours ago. Is that his blood upon your sleeve?" "But of course not. I told you I was vexatiously detained, almost at your gates. Yes, I had the ill luck to blunder into a disgusting business. The 2 rapscallions tumbled out of a doorway under my horse's very nose, egad! It was a near thing I did not ride them down. So I stopped, naturally. I regretted stopping afterward, for I was too late to be of help. It was at the Golden Hind, of course. Something really ought to be done about that place. Yes, and that rogue Marlowe bled all over a new doublet, as you see, and the Deptford constables held me with their foolish interrogatories." "So one of the fighting men was named Marlowe. Is he dead, too, dead in another gutter?" "Marlowe, or Marler, or something of the sort. Wrote plays and sonnets and such stuff, they tell me. I do not know anything about him, though I give you my word now, those greasy constables treated me as though I were a noted frequenter of pot-houses. That sort of thing is most annoying. At all events, he was drunk as David's sow, and squabbling over, saving your presence, a woman of the sort one looks to find in that abominable hole. And so, as I was saying, this other drunken rascal dug a knife into him." But now, to Captain Musgrave's discomfort, Cynthia Allonby had begun to weep heartbrokenly. So he cleared his throat, and he patted the back of her hand. "It is a great shock to you, naturally. Oh, most naturally, and does you great credit. But come now. Pevensey is gone, and as we must all go some day, and our tears cannot bring him back, my dear, we can but hope he is better off, poor fellow, and look on it as a mysterious dispensation, and that sort of thing, my dear." "Oh, Ned, but people are so cruel. People will be saying that it was I who kept poor cousin George in London this past 2 weeks, and that but for me he would have been in France long ago. And then the Queen, Ned! Why, that pig-headed old woman will be blaming it on me that there is nobody to prevent that detestable French king from turning Catholic and dragging England into new wars. And I shall not be able to go to any of the court dances, nor to the masque," sobbed Cynthia, "nor anywhere." "Now, you talk tender-hearted and angelic nonsense. It is noble of you to feel that way, of course. But Pevensey did not take proper care of himself, and that is all there is to it. Now, I have remained in London since the plague's outbreak. I stayed with my regiment, naturally. We have had a few deaths, of course. People die everywhere. But the plague has never bothered me. And why has it never bothered me? Simply because I was sensible, took the pains to consult an astrologer, and by his advice wear about my neck, night and day, a bag of dried toad's blood and powdered cinnamon. It is an infallible specific for men born in February. No, not for a moment do I wish to speak harshly of the dead. But sensible persons cannot but consider Lord Pevensey's death to have been caused by his own carelessness." "Now, certainly that is true," the girl said, brightening. "It was really his own carelessness, and his dear, lovable rashness. And somebody could explain it to the Queen. Besides, I often think that wars are good for the public spirit of a nation, and bring out its true manhood. But then it upset me, too, a little, Ned, to hear about this Marlowe, for I must tell you that I knew the poor man very slightly. So I happened to know that to day he flung off in a rage and began drinking because somebody, almost by pure accident, had burned a packet of his verses." Thereupon Captain Musgrove raised heavy eyebrows and guffawed so heartily that the candle flickered. To think of the fellow's putting it on that plea, when he could so easily have written some more verses! That is the trouble with these poets, if you ask me. They are not practical even in their ordinary everyday lying. No, the truth of it was that the rogue wanted a pretext for making a beast of himself, and seized the first that came to hand. Egad, my dear, it is a daily practice with these poets. They hardly draw a sober breath. Everybody knows that." Cynthia was looking at him in the half-lit room with very flattering admiration. Seen thus, with her scarlet lips a little parted, disclosing pearls, and with her native dark eyes aglow, she was quite incredibly pretty and caressable. She had almost forgotten until now that this stalwart soldier, too, was in love with her. But now her spirits were rising venturously, and she knew that she liked Ned Musgrave. He had sensible notions. He saw things as they really were, and with him there would never be any nonsense about top-lofty ideas. Then, too, her dear old white-haired father would be pleased, because there was a very fair estate. So Cynthia said, "I believe you are right, Ned. I often wonder how they can be so lacking in self-respect. Oh, I am certain you must be right, for it is just what I felt without being able quite to express it. You will stay for supper with us, of course?" "Yes, but you must, because it is always a great comfort for me to talk with really sensible persons. I do not wonder that you are not very eager to stay, though, for I am probably a fright, with my eyes red and with my hair all tumbling down like an old witch's. Well, let us see what can be done about it, sir. There was a hand mirror." And thus speaking, she tripped, with very much the reputed grace of a fairy, toward the far end of the room, and standing a tiptoe, groped at the obscure shelves with a resultant crash of falling china. "Oh, but my lovely cups!" said Cynthia, in dismay. "I had forgotten they were up there. And now I have smashed both of them in looking for my mirror, sir, and trying to prettify myself for you. And I had so fancied them, because they had not their like in England." She looked at the fragments, and then at Musgrave, with wide, innocent, hurt eyes. She was honestly grieved by the loss of her quaint toys. But Musgrave, in his sturdy, common-sense way, only laughed at her seriousness over such kickshaws. "I am for an honest earthenware tankard myself," he said jovially, as the two went in to supper. End of Story 12. Story 13 of O. Henry Memorial Award Prize Stories of 1919 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 13, The High Cost of Conscience, Part 1, by Beatrice Ravenel, from Harper's Magazine. Any woman who can accept money from a gentleman who is in no way related to her. Miss Fowler delivered judgment. "My dear Aunt Maria, you mean a gentleman's disembodied spirit?" Hugh's light, pleasant tones intervened. "A legacy, Maria, is not quite the same thing." Mr. Winthrop Fowler's perfect intonation carried its usual implication that the subject was closed. "Blank is what I call an adventuress," Miss Fowler summed up. She had a way of ignoring objections, of reappearing beyond them, like a submarine with the ultimate and detonating answer. And now she wants to reopen the matter when the whole thing's over and done with? After 3 years? Extraordinary taste! She hitched her black velvet Voltaire armchair a little away from the fire, and spread a vast knitting bag of Chinese brocade over her knees. "I suppose she isn't satisfied? She wants more?" "Naturally. I cannot imagine what other reason she would have for insisting on a personal interview," her brother agreed dryly. He retired into the Transcript as a Trappist withdraws into his vows. A chastened client of Mr. Fowler's once observed that a half-hour's encounter with him resulted in a rueful of asphyxiated topics. Miss Maria, however, preferred disemboweling hers. "I shouldn't have consented," she snapped. "Hugh, if you would be so good as to sit down. You are obstructing the light. And the curtain cord. If you could refrain from twisting it for a few moments." Hugh let his long, high-shouldered figure lapse into the window seat. "And besides, we're all dying to know what she looks like," he suggested. "Speak for yourself, please," said Miss Fowler, with the vivacity of the lady who protests too much. I do. Good Lord, I'm just as bad as the rest of you. All my life I've been consumed to know what Uncle Hugh could have seen in a perfectly obscure little person to make him do what he did. There must have been something." His eyes traveled to a sketch in pencil of a man's head which hung in the shadow of the chimney-piece, a sketch whose uncanny suggestion might have come from the quality of the sitter or merely from a smudging of the medium. "Everything he did always seemed to me perfectly natural," he went on, as though conscious of new discovery. "Even those years when he was knocking about the world, hiding his address. Even when he had that fancy that people were persecuting him. Most people did worry him horribly." A glance flashed between the two middle-aged listeners. It was a peculiar glance, full of a half-denied portent. Then Miss Fowler's fingers, true to their traditions, loosened their grip on her needles and casually smoothed out her work. "I have asked you not to speak of that," she mentioned quietly. "I know. But of course there was no doubt at all that he was entirely recovered before his death. Don't you think so, sir?" His uncle laid down the paper and fixed the young man with the gray, unsheathed keenness which had sent so many witnesses groveling to the naked truth. "No doubt whatever. I always held, and so did both the physicians, that his lack of balance was a temporary and sporadic thing, brought on by overwork and certain unhappy conditions of his life. There has never been any such taint in our branch of the family." "No, so they say," Hugh agreed. "One of our forebears did see ghosts, but that was rather the fashion. And his father, that old Johnny over the fireplace you take after him, Aunt Maria. He was the prize witch-smeller of his generation, and he condemned all the young and pretty ones. That hardly seems well balanced." "Collaterals on the distaff side," Mr. Fowler put in hastily. "If you would read Mendel—" "Mendel? I have read about him." He raised the forefinger of his right hand. "Very suggestive. If your father was a black rabbit," he raised the forefinger of his left, "and your mother was a white rabbit, then your male children would be," he raised all the other fingers and paused as though taken aback by the size of the family, "would be blue guinea pigs with a tendency to club foot and astigmatism, but your female children might only be rather clumsy tangoists with a weakness for cutting their poor relations. That's all I remember, but I do know that because I studied the charts." "Very amusing," said Mr. Fowler indulgently. Hugh flushed. "I am sure it can't be that way." Miss Maria flapped her knitting over. "But everything has changed since my day, and not for the better. The curtain cord?" "Beg pardon," muttered Hugh. His mind went on churning nonsense. "There are 2 days it is useless to flee from. The day of your death, and the day when your family doesn't care for your jokes. For a joke is an intellectual thing, and a mot is the sword of an angel king. Good old Blake, why do the best people always see jokes? Why does a really good one make a whole frozen crowd feel jolly and united all of a sudden?" He pondered on the beneficence of the comic spirit. Hugh was a born deist. It gave him no trouble at all to believe that since the paintings of Velasquez and the great outdoors which he had seen were beautiful, so much the more beautiful must be that God whom he had not seen. It seemed reasonable. As for the horrors, like Uncle Hugh's affair, well, they must be put in for chiaroscuro. A thing couldn't be all white without being blank. The thought of the shadows, however, always made him profoundly uncomfortable, and his instinct right about faced to the lighter surface of life. "Anyhow," he broke silence, "the daughter of Heth must be game, 3-1, and on our native heath." He looked appraisingly about the room, paused at the stiff, distinguished, gray-haired couple, one on either side of the fire. The effect was of a highly finished genre picture. The rich wainscot between low bookshelves, the brooding portraits, the black-blue rug bordered by a veiled Oriental motif, the black velvet cushions that brought out the watery reflections of old Sheraton as even the ancient horsehair had not done, the silver candlesticks, the miniatures, and on the mantel those 2 royal flower-pots whose precarious existence was to his aunt a very fearful joy. Even the tortoise-shell cat, sprawled between the 2 figures like a tiny tiger-skin, was in the picture. It was a room that gently put you into your place. Hugh recalled with a faint grin certain meetings here of philanthropic ladies whose paths had seldom turned into the interiors of older Beacon Street. The state of life to which it had pleased their Maker to call them, he reflected, would express itself preferably in gilding and vast, pale-tinted upholstery and pink bibelots. Oh, quite a lot of pink! This place had worried them into a condition of disconcerted awe. He tried to fancy what it was going to do to the unbidden, resented guest. A queer protest against its enmity, an impulse to give her a square deal, surged up in him from nowhere. After all, whatever else she might be, she was Uncle Hugh's girl. Like all the world, Hugh loved the dispossessed lover. He knew what it felt like. One does not reach the mature age of 24 without having at least begun the passionate pilgrimage. His few tindery and tinselly affairs suspected of following the obvious formula: 3 parts curiosity, 3 parts the literary sense, 3 parts crude young impulse, 1 part distilled moonshine. The real love of his life had been Uncle Hugh. He sprang up with an abruptness to which his elders seemed to be used. He stopped before a brass-trimmed desk and jerked at the second drawer. "Where are those letters, sir?" "You mean—" "Yes, the one you wrote her about the money, and her answer. You put them with his papers, didn't you? Where's the key?" The older man drew from his waistcoat pocket a carved bit of brass. "What do you want with them?" he asked cautiously. "I want to refresh my memory and Aunt Maria's." He took out a neat little pile of papers and began to sort them intently. "Here they are, on top." He laid out a docketed envelope on the desk. "And here are the essays and poems that you wouldn't publish. I considered them the best thing he ever did." "You were not his literary executor," said his uncle coldly. Another stifled glance passed between the seniors, but this time Miss Maria made no effort to restore the gloss of the surface. She sat idle, staring at the papers with a sort of horror. "Put them back," she said. "Winthrop, I do think you might burn them. If you keep things like that too long, the wrong people are sure to get them." "Wait a bit. I haven't seen them for years, not since you published the collected works, with Hamlet left out." The young man lifted a worn brown morocco portfolio tied with a frazzled red ribbon. "And here," his voice dropped, "here it is. The letters he wrote to her and never sent. It was a sort of diary, wasn't it, going on for years? What a howling pity we couldn't print that." "Hugh!" "Don't faint, Aunt Maria. You wouldn't catch me doing anything so indecent. But suppose Dante's dear family had suppressed the Vita Nuova? And it ought to be one of the most extraordinary human documents in the world. Perfectly intimate, all the bars down, full of those flashes of his. Just the man ipsissimus that never happened but that once. Uncle Winthrop, don't you think that I might read it?" "Do you think so? I never did." "Oh, if you put it up to me like that, of course I can't. But what luck that he didn't ask you to send it to her, supposing she's the wrong kind, wasn't it?" His voice trailed off, leaving his lips foolishly open. "You don't mean he did?" "Yes, at the end, after you had left the room," said Mr. Fowler firmly. "And you didn't? Why not?" "As you said, for fear she was the wrong kind." "It was too much to hope that she would be anything else," his aunt broke in, harshly. "Shut your mouth, Hugh. You look like a fool. Think what she might have done with them, she and some of those unspeakable papers." "Oh, I see, I see," groaned the young man. "But how awful not to do the very last thing he wanted. Did you ever try to find out what kind of person she was?" "She took the money. That was enough," cried Miss Fowler. "She got her share, just as though she had been his legal wife." Hugh gave her a dazed look. "You don't mean that she was his illegal one? I never " "Oh, no, no, no," Mr. Fowler interposed. "We have no reason to think that she was otherwise than respectable. Maria, you allow most unfortunate implications to result from your choice of words. We know very little, really." "He met her in Paris when he gave that course of lectures over there. We know that much. And she was an American student. From Virginia, wasn't it? But that was over 20 years ago. Didn't he see her after that?" "I'm sure he did not." "She wasn't with him when he was knocking about Europe?" "Certainly not. She came home that very year and married. As her letter states, she was a widow with 3 children at the time of his death." "I have always considered it providential that he didn't know she was a widow," observed Miss Maria, primly. Her nephew shot her a look that admitted his intermittent amusement in his Aunt Maria, but definitely gave her up. He carefully leaned the portfolio inside the arm of the sofa that neighbored the desk, and picked up the long envelope. "A copy of my letter," said Mr. Fowler. To his sister, watching him as he watched Hugh, came the unaccountable impression that his sure and chiseled surface covered a nervous anxiety. Then Miss Maria, being a product of the same school, dismissed the idea as absurd. Hugh raised bewildered eyes from the letters. "I can't exactly remember," he said. "I was so cut up at the time. Did I ever actually read this before, or was I merely told about it? I went back for mid-years, you know, almost at once. I know my consent was asked, but " "You did not see it. And you, Aunt Maria? Of course you knew about it?" "Certainly," said Miss Fowler, on the defensive. "As usual in business matters, your uncle decided for me. We have been accustomed to act as a family always. To me the solidarity of the family is more than the interest of any member of it." "Oh, I know that the Fowler family is the noblest work of God." The young man looked from one to the other as he might have regarded two strangers whose motives it was his intention to find out. "I've been brought up on that. But what I want to know now is the whyness of this letter." "What do you mean?" Mr. Fowler's voice cut the pause like a trowel executing the middle justice on an earthworm. "Why," Hugh began desperately. "I mean, why wasn't the money turned over to her at once all of it?" "It is customary to notify legatees." "And she wasn't even a legatee," added Miss Maria grimly. "He never made a will." "No," said Hugh, with an ugly laugh. "He merely trusted to our promises." There was a brief but violent silence. "I think, Winthrop," Miss Maria broke in, "that instead of questioning the propriety of my language, you might do well to consider your nephews." Hugh half tendered the letter. "You're so confoundedly clever, Uncle Winthrop. You just put the whole thing up to the poor woman. I can't pick out a word to show where you said it, but the tone of your letter is exactly this: 'Here's the money for you, and if you take it, you're doing an unheard of thing.' She saw it right enough. Her answer is just defense of why she has to take it some of it. She's a mother with 3 children, struggling to keep above water. She's a human animal fighting for her young. So she takes, most apologetically, most unhappily, a part of what he left her, and she hates to take that. It's the most pitiful thing." "Piteous," corrected Miss Maria in a tone like a bite. Mr. Fowler laid the tips of his fingers very delicately on his nephew's knee. "Will you show me the place or places where I make these very damaging observations?" "That's just it. I can't pick them out, but—" "I am sure that you cannot, because they exist only in your somewhat, shall we say, lyrical imagination. I laid the circumstances before the woman, and she acted as she saw fit to act. Hugh, my dear boy, I wish that you would try to restrain your growing tendency to excitability. I know that this is a trying day for all of us." "Oh, Lord, yes. It brings it all back," said Hugh miserably. "I'm sorry if I said anything offensive, sir, but—" He gave it up. "You know I have a devil sometimes." He gave a half embarrassed laugh. "Offensive? If you have said anything offensive?" Miss Fowler boiled over. "Is that all you are going to say, Winthrop? If so—" Mr. Fowler lifted a warning hand. The house door was opening. Then the discreet steps of Gannett came up the hall, followed by something lighter and more resilient. "At least don't give me away to the lady the very first thing," said Hugh, lightly. He shoved the papers into the drawers and swung it shut. His heart was beating quite ridiculously. He would know at last. Why wouldn't he know? Uncle Hugh's girl, Uncle Hugh's girl, he told himself, and his temperamental responsiveness to the interest and the mystery of life expanded like a sea anemone in the Gulf Stream. Gannett opened the door, announced in his impeccable English, "Mrs. Shirley," and was not. A very small, very graceful woman hesitated in the doorway. Hugh's first impression was surprise that there was so little of her. Then his always alert subconsciousness registered. A lady, yes, but a country lady, not de par le monde. Pleasantly rather than well dressed. Those veils are out. He had met her at once with outstretched hand and the most cordial, "I am glad to see you, Mrs. Shirley." Then he mentioned the names of his aunt and uncle. He did not dare to leave anything to Aunt Maria. That lady made a movement that might or might not have been a gesture of recognition. Mr. Fowler, who had risen, inclined his handsome head with a polite murmur and indicated a chair which faced the light. Mrs. Shirley sat, instead, upon the edge of the sofa, which happened to be nearer. With her coming Hugh's expansiveness had suffered a sudden rebuff. A feeling of dismal conventionality permeated the room like a fog. He plumbed it in vain for the wonder and the magic that ought to have been the inescapable aura of Uncle Hugh's girl. Was this the mighty ocean? Was this all? She was a little nervous, too. That was a pity. Nervousness in social relations was one of the numerous things that Aunt Maria never forgave. Then the stranger spoke, and Hugh's friendliness went out to the sound as to something familiar for which he had been waiting. "It is very good of you to let me come," she said. But she must be over 40, Hugh told himself, and her voice is young. So was his, always. It was also very natural and moving, and not untinged by what Miss Fowler called the Southern patois. And her feet are young. Mr. Fowler uttered another polite murmur. There was no help from that quarter. She made another start. "It seemed to me," she addressed Miss Fowler, who looked obdurate. She cast a hopeless glance at the cat, who opened surprising topaz eyes and looked supercilious. Then she turned to Hugh. "It seemed to me," she said steadily, "that I could make you understand. I mean I could express myself more clearly if I could see you than I could by writing. But it is rather difficult." The overheated, inclement room waited. Hugh restrained his foot from twitching. Why didn't Aunt Maria say something? She was behaving abominably. She was still seething with her suppressed outburst like a tea kettle under a cozy of civilization. And it was catching. "I explained at the time, 3 years ago," Mrs. Shirley made the plunge, "why I took the money at all." The hard word was out, and Hugh relaxed. "I don't know what you thought of me, but at the time it seemed like the mercy of Heaven. I had to educate the children. We were horribly poor. I was almost in despair, and I felt that if I could take it from any one I could take it from him." "Yes," said Hugh unhappily. The depression that dropped on him at intervals seemed waiting to pounce. He glanced at his uncle's judicial mask, knowing utterly the distaste for sentimental encounters that it covered. He detested his aunt's aloofness. He was almost angry with this little woman's ingenuousness that put her so candidly at their cynical mercy. "But now," she went on, "some land we have that seemed worth nothing at the time has become very valuable. The town grew out in that direction, and my eldest boy is doing very well indeed, and my daughter is studying for a library position." "The short and simple annals of the poor," sighed Hugh to Hugh. "And so," said little Mrs. Shirley with astounding simplicity, "I came to ask you please to take it back again." She gave an involuntary sigh of relief, as though she had returned a rather valuable umbrella. Mr. Fowler's eyeglasses dropped from his nose as his eyebrows shot up. "Good Lord!" ejaculated Miss Maria, with the unexpectedness of Galatea. "You don't really mean it!" Her bag slid to the floor, and the cat became thoroughly intrigued. "Do I understand you to say," Mr. Fowler's voice was almost stirred, "that you wish to return my brother's legacy to the family?" "Yes," said Mrs. Shirley. "Only it wasn't a legacy. It was merely kindness that let me have it. You never can know how kind it was. But we can get on without it now." Mr. Fowler cleared his throat. To Hugh his manner faintly suggested the cat busy with the yarn, full of a sort of devout curiosity. "Pardon me," he said gently, "but are you sure? Have you given this matter sufficient thought? The sum is a considerable one. Your children—" "I have talked it over with them. They feel just as I do." "A very proper feeling," said Miss Fowler approvingly. "I must say that I never expected it. I shall add part of my share of it to the Marion Fowler ward in the Home for Deficient Children, a most worthy charity. Perhaps I could interest you." "Oh, that would be lovely!" cried Mrs. Shirley. "Anything for children. I've already spoken to my cousin, who is a lawyer, about transferring the securities back to you." "I shall communicate with him at once," said Mr. Fowler. His courtroom manner had burgeoned into his best drawing-room blend of faintly implied gallantry and deep consideration. One almost caught winter getting out of the lap of spring. Then the three heads, which had unconsciously leaned together, suddenly straightened up and turned in the same direction. Hugh stood almost over them. In one hand he held his aunt's knitting, which he had mechanically rescued from the cat. Now he drew out one of the ivory needles and snapped it into accurate halves. "This is atrocious," he said with care and precision. His voice shook. "I shall not touch a cent of it. And" he embraced his uncle and aunt in the same devastating look "neither will you if you have any sense of decency." "I think " "It doesn't matter remotely what you think, sir. What matters is what Uncle Hugh thought." He turned to Mrs. Shirley with an extraordinary softening of tone. "Couldn't you keep it? When he died in the room over this" with a little gasp her glance flew to the ceiling, as though this topographical detail had brought her a sharp realization of that long past scene "he made us promise that you should have it, all of it. He felt that you needed it. He worried about it." "Oh, how kind of him! How kind!" cried the little woman. The poignancy of her voice cut into his disappointment like a sharp ray of light. "Even then to think of me! But don't you understand that he wouldn't want me to take anything that I felt I ought not to take?" "That's the way out," rippled across Mr. Fowler's face. He was experiencing a variety of mental disturbance, but this came to the surface just in time for Hugh to catch it. "Oh, well," he murmured wearily. "Only none for this deficient child, thank you." He walked to the window and stood looking out into the blown spring green of the elm opposite. His ebbed anger had left a residuum of stubbornness. There was still an act of justice to be consummated, and the position of Grand Justicer offered a certain righteous attraction. As he reminded himself, if you put your will to work on a difficult action you were fain to commit, after a while the will worked automatically, and your mind functioned without aid from you, and the action bloomed of itself. This kinetic process was a constant device of the freakish impulse that he called his devil. He deliberately laid the train. "There is one thing more," the alien was saying. Her voice had gained a wonderful fluency amid the general thaw. "I didn't dare to ask before, but if he thought of me then, I have always hoped he left some message for me. A letter, perhaps." End of Story 13, Part 1.